everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much today for jumping on this Zoom call together while we talk about a topic that I think is incredibly relevant and always relevant. So give me a moment here and I'll share my screen so we can get started with this PowerPoint presentation. All right, see if I'm sharing the right screen here. All right, guys, so to dive into it today, we're going to be talking about the anti-inflammatory diet, or how I like to think about it is an anti-inflammatory way of eating. You're going to see over the course of the next 45 minutes, hour or so, how a combination of dietary patterns and ways of eating can help us both reduce high inflammatory foods in our diet while increasing the sources of anti-inflammatory foods. So a couple of objectives that we're going to cover today is defining exactly what is inflammation in a relatively, I think, concise way, and its role ultimately in chronic diseases. We're going to then define foods that can actually promote inflammation. I think it's important to know what foods can increase inflammation in our body, because being aware of those foods is the first step to ultimately changing dietary patterns so we can lessen those pro-inflammatory foods and then swap them in favor of foods that can actually lessen the inflammation in our body. So we're going to be identifying what those foods are that can reduce inflammation, and then ultimately kind of ending with this concept of what is an anti-inflammatory diet pattern. So giving you a couple of different ways that you can look at this diet and apply it kind of in a real life setting. So when we think about inflammation, I think that's an important place to start, right? We can't talk about an anti-inflammatory diet without really understanding what inflammation means and how it affects our body. So in the very basics of sense, inflammation is a normal, expected, and needed response that our body goes through, right? Not all inflammation is bad. What inflammation is just an immune response. It is this kind of reaction to a stressor or to an injury or to an infection. It's our body's natural defense to react to something that our body sees as harmful. So when we think about it in most day-to-day situations, inflammation can be acute, right? Think about you're walking down the sidewalk and you accidentally trip and you scrape your knee. Your body is going to react to that injury. It's going to cause this release of substances, release of compounds. Without getting too technical, I've listed a couple of there because they do play into a couple of the slides to come. So we have things like C-reactive protein, we have cytokines, we have our white blood cells in our immune system. All of this is released as part of that immune response, and that causes this increase in inflammation. But that inflammation helps our body tackle the task ahead. So in the sense of a scraped knee, it helps bring in those white blood cells. It helps kind of pool all the needed, we'll call them protectors, to our body to help start healing. So that's an example of how inflammation is a good thing in some cases, right? When we have an infection, we want our immune response to come help break down that infection. So these are acute examples of infections. But what we're mostly going to be talking about today, and I think where inflammation becomes most relevant when we think about lifestyle and diet, is this concept of a chronic inflammation, right? This is a more lower range, more drawn out example of inflammation. So it's not as acute as an injury, let's say. It's something that happens on a more long-term example. And one of the key differences, I think, between acute and chronic inflammation is acute inflammation tends to have an endpoint, right? When your scraped knee has officially formed a scab, it's healing, it's gone, that inflammation is going to settle and be done. Whereas with some of these more chronic examples of inflammation, there really isn't an end to that stressor. The body doesn't have a way of turning that inflammation off. And that's where chronic inflammation has a lot of its, can create some of these more chronic style of diseases and conditions. So as far as today, chronic inflammation, I think, is going to be the big basis of the inflammation that we're talking about. where chronic inflammation can kind of play into our health, into our lifestyle, is we know that chronic inflammation can contribute to a variety of chronic conditions as well. And it's very important to note that this is not an exhaustive list. When we think about inflammation and the state of our cells and our bodies, there's a lot of different ways that inflammation can contribute to the changes and to certain conditions. But I picked out, I think, some of the most common ones, something that when you look at Americans as a whole, a lot of people tend to experience some of these past medical histories as part of their health history. So we see chronic inflammation contributing to conditions like diabetes, like cardiovascular disease, chronic respiratory disease, or COPD as another example, and cancer. There has been some thought that chronic kind of low dwelling inflammation in certain respects can contribute to certain types of cancers, not all. The way that inflammation kind of contributes to these types of chronic diseases is through a couple of these different mechanisms. And again, there's a lot of other things that I'm not covering here, but when we're zeroing in on the key concepts, there are some that we know just result in this higher response of inflammation within the body. The first one, aging. This is something we can't control, right? We want to age, we want to live as long as we can. But as we age, as our cells are exposed to more and more and more over the course of years, we just develop natural wear and tear, even on the cellular level. So this is something that is expected. And oopsies, I went back by accident. Sorry, guys. We expect as we age that we're just going to have this kind of increase in inflammation as our cells also age with us. Smoking. I think this one is very understandable. I think a lot of people recognize the dangers associated with smoking. For those of you who may have attended our previous topic on antioxidants, this was one of those conversations as well, the creation of what we call free radicals, or elements that our body may be exposed to that can create tissue damage. And tissue damage is an example of something that puts stress on the body and can increase inflammation. So smoking here is a great example of how something can create harm to our cells and ultimately result in this kind of longer term chronic inflammation. Obesity. This is one that I don't think we necessarily think about as inflammation, right? We don't think about our weight as something that can contribute to inflammation. But what we're finding is actually this correlation between obesity, or this excess adipose tissue, which is another phrase of saying excess of that fat tissue or that padding, having almost like an endocrine relationship within the body, which means that extra adipose tissue, that extra fat tissue, has been found to actually secrete inflammatory compounds, right? Secrete those things like cytokines that we mentioned on the previous slide. So a lot of research is kind of going into, and we're doing a lot of kind of looking into how does even our weight and weight management play into kind of modulating the level of inflammation within our body, even these low range chronic inflammation. And then lastly, biggest topic for today is obviously going to be the diet. How can certain ways of eating, including certain types of foods, ultimately increase the amount of inflammation that our body is being exposed to? And that's going to be, a fun topic, but a big one. So to dive right into it, we're talking about inflammation. What foods do we know, based on some research and literature, increases inflammation in the body? And that's really going to come down to these handful here. Going through them kind of piece by piece, I think it's important to understand what the mechanism is to why do these foods possibly, increase inflammation in the body. The first one, and you might have read this, seeing it more and more in online, in articles, even on previous presentations that we've presented, other programmings, is this association with red meat and processed meat. And it's impact on our body and on our health. So we are seeing more of this relationship with having a diet very high, and I'm talking about large quantities, right? Large quantities of red meat and processed meats in our diet is being associated with this increased risk of inflammation. And the big reason here is the way in which they're processed, for starters. So if we think about processed meats, they tend to be preserved with a lot of chemical preservatives. That's being one of the big issues with processed meats is they're very chemically preserved. So these are unnatural things that are being done to keep that meat shelf stable for longer. So by eating it and having it in large quantities, we're exposing that kind of chemical preservation into our body, creating the inflammation. The way in which they could also be prepared can create some form of inflammation. So when we think about smoking or curing or cooking these meats at really, really, really high temperatures, these can create compounds also that can be inflammatory to the body and to our gut as we digest them. Red meat, a little bit different than processed meats, because not all red meat is processed, right? You can get a relatively natural cut of red meat without having to worry about these additives or these processing. So you're a step in the right direction, but we're finding that even with our red meats, particularly our beef, and I even kind of for a different reason kind of group pork in this area into this category as well. The proposed thought here, and a lot of this we're still really trying to determine, I think, from the scientific side, what we're seeing in these studies, but the proposed mechanism is the relationship with the amount of heme iron that's found in these types of meats, and how that quantity, when consumed over a long period of time in large quantities, how this amount of heme iron is impacting the body and promoting this inflammatory response. So that's kind of the concept as to why we're starting to see that red meats and processed meats can increase kind of this level of low range inflammation in the body. Next, refined grains. So refined grains is another way of kind of categorizing the group of carbohydrates that are typically called white. So white bread, white pasta, white rice. You can also think about those packaged carbohydrates like crackers and cereals and maybe frozen waffles, pancakes. This category of carbohydrates, when using white or stripped flour, are not a nutrient source dense food, right? These refined grains have had their fiber, their vitamins and minerals kind of removed in the processing of that food. So you're left with mostly a product that is very, very carb heavy without any other benefits associated with it. So with this carbohydrate, as it's broken down very, very easily in the body, without fiber, without vitamins, without minerals, you're seeing this increase in this insulin response. And diets that are very high in refined grains, in white breads, in white pastas, white rice in large quantities, is being found to have this effect on the insulin responses within the body, and the more there's insulin rising in the body, the more they're seeing this association with tumor growth and inflammation. So for that reason, they're kind of seeing that these diets very high in these refined grains is being associated with the inflammation as well. Sugar sweetened beverages. This one is going to be more of those category of our sodas, right? Our energy drinks. Think juices, particularly juices with added sugars included there, like juice cocktails that aren't even really juice based, but more sugars with some flavorings. Some of our coffees in the morning, if we think about the syrups that we may be pumping those coffees with, creamers, sugar, these sugar sweetened beverages are providing a lot of excess calories in the way of sugar without actually contributing any other nutritional benefits. So again, fiber, vitamins, minerals. So we're getting a lot of calories in excess without benefit. And that sometimes over the long-term period results in more body fat, right? This excess adipose tissue, which, going back to the previous slide, is what's driving up some of these chronic state of inflammation in the body. And lastly, grouping these two points together, trans fat and high intake of saturated fat. So food items that have trans fat in it or food items that have a large quantity of saturated fat put a lot of stress on the heart. Can lead to things like atherosclerosis or certain heart diseases. So as the tissues of our heart is being exposed to these types of foods that are putting a little bit more of a stress on them, you're going to see this kind of increase in inflammation. To give you a couple of examples of where you may see saturated fat in a diet or trans fat into some of those foods, I would say the first thing is to think about your packaged baked goods. I think this is one that we oftentimes don't think about as being a source of fat, but things like prepared packaged donuts, cakes, cookies, pies, things that have been, shelf stable and sitting on that counter, not necessarily at the bakery counter, but on the store shelves. They tend to be full of a lot of butter, eggs, and additives like partially hydrogenated fats that help preserve that food item for longer. But ultimately, those additives are what's kind of driving up this inflammation in our diet. So we've identified now food items, right, that over time, and again, it's chronic, it's not one time thing I'm worried about. It's when our diet is day in and day out high in these types of foods are causing this kind of increased level of inflammation in our body. We know this now, right? But what do? I think the first step to, adopting an anti-inflammatory diet is reducing the foods that we know promote inflammation. That's the first step. And what that means is making swaps wherever we can. So going kind of item by item, if your diet is very, very high in red meat and processed meats, particularly, start incorporating in more of those leaner protein meats. Think things like chicken or fish. You can also incorporate in plant-based proteins as an alternative here. So if you've ever heard of Meatless Monday, that is something that is kind of starting to become popular over the last couple of years because it's pushing this idea that we can get good protein from plant-based sources as well. So by swapping in plant-based proteins as opposed, maybe on days that we would traditionally have ground beef or a hamburger, we can kind of help balance out some of these food items and ultimately in our diet. When we're thinking about refined grains like white bread, for instance, or white rice, a really easy swap to kind of promote this improvement in our body inflammation is switch them in for whole grains. So products that have the word whole wheat or whole grain on the ingredient list. So instead of white bread, white pasta, we're looking more at whole wheat bread, whole wheat pasta. Maybe it's just simply switching out white rice for brown rice. Here you're doing yourself two benefits. You're lessening the white rice, so you're lessening that pro-inflammatory food, and you're increasing fiber, which down the line, we'll talk about the benefits of incorporating in fiber as an anti-inflammatory food. When it comes to our sweetened beverages, that's just swapping those sweetened beverages for unsweetened alternatives. This may take some time, but looking for opportunities when you can. If you have a lot of soda in your diet, or if you have a lot of sweetened teas in your diet, start looking for, can you swap one can out a day with something else? Maybe it's soda to seltzers. You still get the carbonation, you still get that enjoyment, but you're not really having as much of that added sugar effect. For your sweetened teas, maybe instead of sweetening with sugar, you start sweetening more with lemon or natural approaches that can kind of lessen the amount of sugar that you're having. And lastly, trans fat, saturated fats, looking at our diet and really trying to reduce those sources of saturated fats and trans fats, and then in favor for more heart healthy fats. So things like, we'll talk a little bit about more as we go through the slides, but think about things like avocado, or if you've heard the phrases before of monounsaturated, polyunsaturated. These are the heart healthy kinds of fats that we're going to really want to base our diet out around. So these are kind of the big concepts, right? We've made swaps now. We've identified those high inflammation promoting foods. We swap them out for maybe some lower inflammation-based foods. That in itself is kind of helping us towards that direct goal. But there's some items and there's some compounds, we'll call it, that's found naturally in foods that in their own sense are anti-inflammatory. So that's going to be what the next couple of slides are going to be covering. Now, these compounds you may have heard before because they do play into a lot of different roles. Again, for those who may have attended the previous webinar on antioxidants and eating the rainbow and all the benefits of antioxidants, this is one of the big reasons why. Antioxidants can really help the body kind of neutralize those free radicals or those things that are found naturally in our day-to-day life that can cause tissue damage. When we incorporate in antioxidants, it helps us kind of remove some of those undesirable inflammatory effects. So incorporating in a lot of antioxidants through our food. Another key compound or concept is phytonutrients. So phytonutrients is a very, very vast topic. Phytonutrients are going to have a lot of different applications and found in a lot of different types of foods. So we'll go into what exactly is a phytonutrient and how do I know if I'm getting phytonutrients in my diet. And then lastly, another thing that we're finding helps promote anti-inflammatory patterns is going to be incorporating in omega-3s. And omega-3s is a type of fat, particularly one of those polyunsaturated fats or a heart-healthy fat that's found in select food items. So when we're building this backbone of an anti-inflammatory diet, we're going to want to look for the inclusion of foods that include these types of compounds, antioxidants, phytonutrients, and omega-3s. To kind of help you start seeing it in real life application, our antioxidants are found in a lot of dietary foods in the way of our vitamins. So not all vitamins are antioxidants, but there are a select handful that are. So one of the most, I think, common ones or ones we're most familiar with will be our vitamin C. We know vitamin C when we think, oh gosh, we're getting a cold, I think I'm getting a cold, let me take a vitamin C, an emergency. The reason there is it has this effect, this role as an antioxidant that can kind of help neutralize some of those infection risks or this low range inflammation. So we want to incorporate in vitamin C foods throughout our diet as much as we can. And listed here on the slide for you are a couple of different ways that you can easily incorporate in vitamin C through your diet. You see it primarily in your fruits and vegetables. I think that's one of the biggest places you're going to find vitamin C, if not exclusively. So think about kiwi, grapefruit. A lot of those really tropical fruits are really good sources of vitamin C as well. But it's not fruit alone. You see vitamin C also found in good vegetables as well, particularly in your bell peppers and your broccoli. So vitamin C, kind of thinking about incorporating that in your diet, particularly as a way to kind of help naturally re-regulate the inflammation in your body. The next antioxidant is also technically a vitamin, but hidden as a different name. So carotenoids is a version of vitamin A. Vitamin A has a lot of different derivatives. For the sake of the discussion of antioxidants, we're going to be looking particularly at this phase, this application of vitamin A in the way of carotenoids. And this category is broken down into a couple of different phytonutrients, we'll call them. So lycopene, beta-carotene, and lutein. These are specific compounds that are found under this umbrella of carotenoids. And you'll see again that it's a really big emphasis on fruits and veggies. So lycopene being found in your tomatoes, grapefruit, watermelon, and guava. If we think about it, all of those foods have the same thing in common, and that is that really beautiful, almost red ruby color. That's because that's the color that lycopene encapsulates. When you see that color in food, when you see that color in fruits and veggies, you're likely looking at lycopene as one of the nutritional compounds in there. Beta-carotene, same concept. When we look at those food items in beta-carotene, sweet potato, carrot, cantaloupe, the color that comes to our mind, right away is that orange color. And it's the same reason. A lot of these phytonutrients specifically are associated with colors within the food. So when you see this nice, beautiful orange color, it tends to be a hint that that food item is going to be a good source of beta carotene. And lastly, lutein. This one, you're seeing a little bit more in your darker greens. So spinach, kale, broccoli, peas, lettuce, you're getting that green hue. So that, is an example also of where you can get the benefit of adding this antioxidant in. The last main vitamin that is an example of an antioxidant, a dietary antioxidant, is vitamin E. Vitamin E is also known in function to have these antioxidant applications. So the best way to get vitamin E, in my opinion, based on what you're seeing here, is going to be in our nuts and our seeds. So incorporating in nuts and seeds as part of your day-to-day dietary pattern can be a really good way to incorporate in a very crucial element like vitamin E, but also bring in a little bit of that antioxidant, anti-inflammatory approach. Moving away from the concept of vitamins as antioxidant sorts, you also have that micronutrients or smaller compounds of our vitamins and minerals can have antioxidant properties. So that would be the case here in the sense of selenium. Selenium really does in its own way prevent and protect against that oxidative damage or that free radical damage that promotes inflammation. So incorporating in selenium in your diet is a really crucial piece here. A lot of us may be doing this already without realizing it because selenium is found in some key foods like chicken, egg, tuna. So for those who, incorporate in a lot of those animal proteins, you're getting definitely selenium there in your standard serving sizes. But there's also plant-based sources of selenium as well, particularly in Brazil nuts, which you see is very, very high in selenium, as well as in lentils. So incorporating in here other ways of protein, particularly in lentils, Brazil nuts, and fish like tuna, could be a really good way to get selenium in, while lessening maybe the source of some of those other red meats or processed meats as well. So this kind of wraps up the concept of antioxidants, right? Antioxidants, combination of foods, particularly, those key vitamins, some of our minerals as well, that helps lessen or neutralize free radicals that promote inflammation. Antioxidants is just one way that we can incorporate in these good anti-inflammatory practices into our diet, but the other way is by including phytochemicals or phytonutrients. So I've already kind of hinted to the concept of phytochemicals, phytonutrients over the course of our discussion today, but they're a little different. They're separate than antioxidants because they are just so much wider, and their properties and what they do to the diet is so well-versed that they could be a conversation all in itself. But for the role of today, what we're really seeing is they are, what gives our fruits and vegetables that beautiful, vibrant color. And one of the benefits to including these phytochemicals and phytonutrients is this we call it biologically active, like it has this active ability to lessen the inflammation in the body. Because of the way that the compound works. So we're talking really, really nitty gritty benefits to the foods that we're eating, not, looking at diet, not just as calories or not just as macros like carbs, fat, and protein, but really starting to see into the way that we're eating on a really, really almost cellular level and the benefits that these foods can bring us when we think about phytochemicals and other active, natures of the nutrition that we take in. So a lot of kind of information, right, over the course of these first 30 minutes, a lot on the way of what makes up the reason why some foods may be pro-inflammatory or causing inflammation and why some foods may be anti-inflammatory, reducing inflammation. So we know the mechanisms, at least a little bit more behind it. But what does this look like as a diet? How do we really build and apply this day in and day out? And there's a lot of different ways to look at this. And I think right now is a great way to kind of touch upon the topic of there is no anti-inflammatory diet. It's not the same way as, some other diets out there. Like if we think about keto, which has a set strict, concept of what makes it a keto diet. Here, anti-inflammatory diet to me is more about a lifestyle. It's more about practices and adjustments and starting to gradually adopt these concepts of balance, lessening pro-inflammatory foods while increasing anti-inflammatory foods. So although, there is no set diet, a lot of different places and institutions online have tried to create ways that we can think about it in a more holistic approach. And this slide here is one way to do that. Thinking about, our diet in the way of a pyramid. For those who have been interested in nutrition for we'll say decades at this point, you all may remember the concept of the nutrition pyramid. That was one of the original ways that we educated and talked about nutrition. What should be the building blocks or the pyramid of the food? So it's using that concept and applying this lens of anti-inflammatory to it here. So what you'll see is, as with pyramids, you want to put the strongest, most important concepts at the bottom, right? That's the base of your structure. That's the base of your strength. So when we're thinking about diet, that's the core of our diet. That's what we really want to have the majority of our diet consisting of. And in this anti-inflammatory pyramid, that is really resting on our fruits and vegetables. Really incorporating in fruits and veggies daily and in large quantities. And the reason for that is because of the vitamins that we've seen found in a lot of those fruits and vegetables, vitamin A, C, E, as well as our phytonutrients and those beautiful color profiles. So key piece here is the fruits and veggies. But right next to that, in a relatively, similar quantity, we're looking at our whole grains and starchy vegetables, including beans and legumes. So here, as you look at the pyramid, you're seeing a lot of color, right? You're seeing the whole wheat bread kind of right there at the center. We have the sweet potato. I believe that's a pumpkin. We have the beans kind of on the side. All of this is bringing in that color. And I emphasize color a lot because that's a very visual way of almost checking in on ourselves and how we're eating. We want there to be so much color on our plate because that tends to mean we're getting the variety of vitamins and minerals that we need. Whereas if we were to think about this whole grain starchy vegetable category as refined grains, right, we would be looking more at white pasta, white bread, cereals, white rice. It's kind of devoid of color here. So really pushing the whole grains and the starchy vegetables as the contributor to our carbohydrates in this type of anti-inflammatory diet. Moving up the pyramid, you're going to see for our protein, the focus is really on fish, seafood, and healthy fats. So fish, being a really big source of omega-3s or that heart-healthy fat, is one of the big proponents of why it's anti-inflammatory. So when we're thinking about an anti-inflammatory diet or diet principles, it's really starting to incorporate in more fish and seafood as our protein source, not always relying so much on red meat for sure, but also kind of balancing it out with even our chicken and our poultry and our egg. When we're thinking maybe about that more plant-based approach, you can still get good fats and heart-healthy fats and a little bit of protein too through things like nuts and seeds. So you'll see that on the other side of the pyramid there, under healthy fats is that nice array of our, mixed nuts. The reason here is you're going to get protein, you're going to get fiber, and you're also going to get that good heart-healthy fat. Things like unsaturated fats, as opposed to saturated fats that are found in a lot of our baked goods and some of those fattier cuts of meat. Moving up the pyramid even still, you see here, we still have animal sources of protein, and this is okay, but we're funneling up, right? The quantity of our diet. We don't want it to be where the majority of our diet is coming from things like cheese, egg, meat, these heavy fats that have primarily saturated fat. We want to start tapering the quantity of that in favor for some more of the fish, the whole grains, the starchy veggies, the fruits and the veggies. So incorporating in things like cheese and egg and poultry, okay here, but in reducing quantities for balance. Spices and herbs we haven't talked about directly yet, but I'm glad that this pyramid brings it up because it is an important aspect of an anti-inflammatory diet, particularly because some of the phytonutrients, because there are so many of them, Some of them are found in spices and herbs specifically. When we think about garlic, when we think about turmeric, cumin, cinnamon, a lot of these we're finding have these relationships kind of with anti-inflammatory properties and anti-inflammatory benefits. So we want to start cooking more with spices and herbs in our diet. You know, using, and I say cooking, right? Diet, we want to incorporate them in our preparation process, not necessarily as a pill or, you know, something that we're taking in a high concentration. We want all of this to be done naturally through the actual food, the actual roots, and the actual herbs and spices. And lastly, because I know this is included on the pyramid, and I think a question that I also get a lot of times about is, well, what about red wine? What about dark chocolate? Isn't there the resveratrol in there that can help with anti-inflammatory kind of properties? And the answer is there are some, you know, studies out there that promote this concept that incorporating in some red wine, some dark chocolate can help with anti-inflammatory benefits. But you'll see it is the smallest one up there at the top, right? We don't want this to be the backbone of our diet. And if it's not something you include in your diet every day, I don't necessarily recommend that you start it for anti-inflammatory purposes, right? It's still got to be something that we do just on occasion, I would say. And we always have to think about our own health patterns, right? This is a very general look of an anti-inflammatory diet, but everybody's going to have their own health backgrounds and maybe their own dietary restrictions also. So just because it's found here on the pyramid doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be what's most appropriate for you and you know, in your particular goals. Pardon me. So this is one way of thinking of, you know, the anti-inflammatory diet, you know, in this pyramid concept. To me, when I hear anti-inflammation and I think about everything that we talked about today, truthfully, the first diet that jumps out to me is the Mediterranean diet. And this one has become very, very, I think, well known. And I want to say even this year, it was deemed the healthiest or the best diet based on US News, I think it was. And the reason being is I think it helps fit a lot of these facets of what is a generally healthy diet, what lessens inflammation, what promotes nutrient density. So that's why I wanted to take a couple of minutes here to talk about it. Because if you're looking to learn, if you're looking really to apply and look for resources, there's a lot of great information on what a Mediterranean diet is. And I think it really does kind of capture the essence and the core of what we're trying to achieve today, which is lessening inflammatory foods while increasing those that can help us fight the inflammation. So why does the Mediterranean diet work? I think it's because its big push really is going to be on fish. Similar to the pyramid, you saw fish first when it came to our protein sources. The Mediterranean diet also incorporates a big emphasis on fish intake. At minimum 1 to 2 fish a week, right? But some even incorporate in fish 5 to 6 times weekly when we're thinking about, you know, a standard portion size or incorporating it into meals. So fish and seafood, I would say here. And they do that focus on fish in exchange for the red meat. So you don't tend to see as much red meat, as much land animal meat like beef, pork, in a Mediterranean diet style. You see primarily fish. And then they incorporate in poultry, you know, egg from time to time, but it's not the biggest emphasis of their diet. They go a little bit more like pescatarian, so to speak. They also have a really, really big focus on extra virgin olive oil. Mediterranean diet, you think Mediterranean, you think olives, right? They are really known for their olive oil, but it's also a big backbone of the nutritional benefit for them. Olive oil has that omega-3 compound in it. Olive oil is really great for the omega-3s. So as is the fatty fish in the salmon and things like that. And it's an unsaturated fat. So when, you know, they have this big focus on olive oil throughout their day, that's, I think, one of the benefits and why you see this promotion of good health in a Mediterranean diet. And lastly, it's really, really, really powered by plants. In addition to the fish for the protein and the olive oil for the fat, you see that a lot of their other food items come from whole grains, legumes, vegetables, fruits, nuts, and seeds. I do think I want to correct myself in the sense of extra virgin olive oil, really, really good source of monounsaturated fat, but not necessarily as high in what I would say omega-3s. That's going to be primarily in your fatty fish. But still has a lot of health benefits. Heart healthy fat there in the monounsaturated. A good resource that I think is available to everyone, and what I always like to include things that you guys can look up on your own, you know, after the presentation, things to look for, would be the dietary guidelines for Americans. They come out with this every 5 years, and they look at the American, you know, population as a whole, and they try and identify what are some dietary goals that we want to achieve, you know, as a nation, as, you know, what can we do best for ourselves for promoting good health. And this year, as part of their release, is they actually included this breakdown of the Mediterranean style of eating, in addition to just a standard healthy diet. So you're seeing the Mediterranean diet now kind of being included in as almost like that go-to diet, so to speak, to try and eat and choose. So just to kind of help you read what this is, it's just a snippet, you know, I took from the dietary guidelines form, but it lists the amount of particular foods that you would want to have based on your daily calories. So I just picked 1800 here, something right kind of in the middle. And you'll see that along the side here, they list those food groups, right? Key food groups: vegetables, fruit, grains, dairy, protein, oil, everything we've basically been talking about today as far as the food groups go. And based on the Mediterranean diet here, you're going to see that they put at least 2 cups to 2.5 cups of fruits and vegetables every single day. Really, really making sure we're getting that daily intake of vegetables, which is oftentimes lacking in the standard American diet. This handout or this snippet is great because it also breaks those vegetables down based on the color. You know, starting to think about our diet, not just from those big food groups, but zeroing in on the phytonutrients and on the specific vitamins and minerals. So when you're working and getting those vegetables in daily, try and get a variety of the different colors of your vegetables: dark green vegetables, red and orange vegetables. I'm incorporating in beans also, because beans kind of hit multiple categories here. So this is kind of a really great structured way of trying to build your diet also when you're thinking about what should I eat and how. It incorporates in grains as well, with that inclusion of the whole grains as we were talking about. Protein foods. So the protein I have listed here in that red category, it still includes the meats there, poultry and eggs, but remember, really the core of the Mediterranean diet is just take a step back from the red meats. So I would lean a little bit more towards your poultry here and your eggs, as opposed to meats like red meats when we're having those food groups throughout the week. Seafood, we have 15-ounce equivalents a week of seafood. So if we think about a standard serving of protein of about 3 to 5 ounces for a seafood, 15 ounces a week basically comes out to 3 to 5 servings of seafood a week. And I think as standard Americans, this is an area that we also are very low on. We don't tend to have a lot of seafood. Down here in South Florida, we may have a little bit more compared to other areas of the US. So I understand there may be some regional differences, but generally speaking, check in with yourself and really get an idea of how much seafood are we having. And if it's appropriate for your diet, definitely try and incorporate in more seafood, particularly your fatty fish like salmon, mackerel, halibut, because that's where you're going to get the majority of those omega-3s. And omega-3s are really a big health benefit for a lot of reasons. And then down here, 24 grams of oil a day. And that's just because a big piece of the Mediterranean diet is the olive oil inclusion. So to summarize kind of the Mediterranean style diet for you guys, it goes back to the balance. What are we increasing? What are we decreasing? And how does this ultimately influence the quality of the diet and the diet patterns? So what we see in the Mediterranean diet is this huge increase in nutrient-dense items. And nutrient-dense items to me are foods that have fiber, foods that have vitamins, minerals, protein. So the nutrient-dense food items in the Mediterranean style diet is that big emphasis on fruits and veggies, right? It's also on our leaner proteins. So think maybe the nuts and the seeds. It's incorporating in those heart healthy fish. So we're really incorporating in whole foods as part of the Mediterranean diet. It's a really big emphasis on omega-3s, particularly found in those fatty fish like the salmon and the mackerel. And there's a good focus on dietary fiber, and that's primarily because of the whole grains. It's because of the fruits and the vegetables. Now, by having the diet built up of all of these beneficial items, you're seeing this natural decline in a diet full of added sugars, full of red meat, processed meats, and solid fats. Particularly solid fats would be things like butter. So instead of cooking with butter, which is a solid fat at room temperature, they're cooking more with olive oil, which is a liquid temperature, a liquid fat at room temperature. So this is kind of that relationship we're seeing, and why I think the Mediterranean diet is starting to come out as one of the benefits and one of those healthy kind of long-term diets to follow. So to kind of help summarize it for you guys again, what do we do? There's a lot of different topics that we talked about today, but I think it can really be boiled down to this concept of you want to make sure you're getting those non-starchy vegetables and fruit every day, and you want to choose those beautiful colors. Particularly here, they listed green, orange, yellow, purple. The more color that you have, you know, that's what we want to have on our plate, because that's typically the sign that we're getting those phytonutrients, very important compounds for you know, fighting inflammation. So we want to aim for at least 5 servings of fruits and veggies a day. So I would say 2 servings of fruit, 3 servings of vegetables, because we always want to try and incorporate in those veggies too. I don't think you can go too high on your fruits and vegetables, truthfully. So I know here it says aim for 10 servings a day. That's obviously like a really great goal to aim for, but work your way there. I think for those of us that fruits and veggies aren't the mainstay in our diet right now, you have to start with what's doable. So maybe for you, it's starting and making sure you have 1 serving of fruit and 1 serving of vegetable every day. Start that momentum, start the benefit, and really increase and work towards the minimum of the 5 servings total. To kind of help guide what exactly is a serving here, there's a couple of ways to look at it. So when we're thinking about a fruit, it's a medium-sized fruit that could be thought of, you know, the size of your fist, maybe the size of a baseball. You can also think about it as half a cup of canned or frozen fruit. If you want to use, you know, servingware to kind of get an idea. Typically, the cups of fruit are prepackaged in half-cup servings, so that would be, you know, a very convenient and easy way to incorporate in some of those fruits during your day. Just make sure that they're not in syrup. We want them to be naturally packaged in 100% juice, and then drain the juice out. For cooked vegetables, half a cup. So, you know, that's kind of getting used to the concept of probably, depending on your fist, it might be, you know, a little bit less than that. Or raw vegetables, that would be primarily things like salad greens, spinach. That would be 1 cup, you know, because they tend to take up a little bit more space. Then in review, really starting to incorporate in those omega-3 rich fish. That's a really big concept. Mediterranean diet, yes, but also you see it in even in that anti-inflammatory period, the emphasis on the fish. So some of those good examples of omega-3 rich fish would be salmon, tuna, trout, halibut, sardines, mackerel. I would pick, you know, 1 to 2 a week, really, and try and build that into your routine. And if you can swap a fish in place of a red meat or a processed meat, you're going to be getting double the benefit, reducing the pro-inflammatory food and increasing an anti-inflammatory food. We want to incorporate in on more whole grains. And this is because it's that swap, it's that balancing game. We want to lessen the amount of refined grains, those white breads, white rice, white cereals and crackers, and start incorporating in more of the whole grains, more of the grains that have fiber, and more of the vitamin and minerals still intact. So look for opportunities to include quinoa, brown rice, barley, farro. Maybe it's just switching to whole wheat bread or a frozen waffle that has whole grain as its first ingredient. And looking beyond the food and how you prepare. Cook more with herbs and spices, because a lot of these here listed are going to have in their own way these anti-inflammatory properties because of some of the phytonutrients that are found naturally in these herbs and spices. And I think a relatively easy thing to do too is look at our snacks and switch in, nuts and seeds as snacks, as opposed to some of our more packaged snacks like chips and pretzels and maybe even candies that sometimes people grab for as their snack on the go, and start looking at more nuts, seeds, and then obviously fruits and veggies if you can. And that kind of rounds out the topic for today. I will open the floor to any questions.